Who was Socrates? And what is the famous Socratic method? What's so special about Socrates anyway, since we don't have so much as a sentence ever written by him? And there were a number of important philosophers who came before him. Everything we know about Socrates comes from two contemporary sources: his faithful student Plato and his friend and neighbor Xenophon, who in the Memorabilia gives us the neighbor's and fellow soldier's view of Socrates the man. Now, if we are to believe Plato, and in this I think we have no right to believe Plato, in one of Plato's epistles he says that in the matter of the developed philosophical treatises presented in the dialogues, all credit goes to Socrates, Plato doing little more than serving as a kind of recording secretary. Of course, this can't possibly be the case. Plato obviously was doing more than sitting as an amanuensis and recording what he heard. But surely what is the case is that Socrates profoundly influenced the people who were most closely associated with him. And more to the point, some he profoundly influenced turned out to be among the most estimable of figures in the ancient Greek world, and of course chiefly Plato himself. Plato, by the way, is not the family name. Plato is a fellow with quite broad shoulders, and so the nickname Platon. Now, Socrates' dates are 469 to 399 BC, and perhaps the first social and historical fact warranting attention is that he begins his career, as it were, in an Athens that had lost a devastating, long war against Sparta. What one must understand as one goes through the dialogues of Plato is that these Socratic dialogues are conducted by the losing side. It is vitally important to keep that in mind. It certainly helps explain why so much in the political part of the Socratic program looks very much like the Spartan regimen for raising children, training armies, etc. In one or another dialogue, we might be inclined to hear Socrates saying in so many words, and this is not uncommon when we look at the post-war literature of a losing side, look, the winning side excelled in certain respects in which we Athenians found ourselves unable to measure up. Where is it we went wrong? Where is it we went wrong in our child-rearing, in our military strategy, in our economics, our social life? These are burning questions in a post-war period, of course. So there are utterly practical questions that animate the dialogues. We tend to think of the dialogues of Plato as this sort of ethereal, otherworldly kind of colloquy engaged in by people who don't quite have their feet on the ground. Quite the contrary. Obviously, the man who comes to teach that the whole point of philosophy is to prepare us to die is not a person with an overweening interest in the merely practical affairs of daily life, but he's not indifferent to these. So I say one point I'd want to make about Socrates is that he is a loyal and faithful soldier, a defender of Athens, who has seen his polis defeated by Sparta, and this clearly summons him to a deeper reflection on what Athenian life has been all about, where things went wrong, how it can be prevented in the future. What shall we conclude from the fact that he didn't write things down or establish a school, and that what we know about his philosophy comes through the words and recollections of others? He seems to be a figure shrouded in mystery, unless we're willing to take at face value things said about him by Xenophon and the portrayal that's given to us in the dialogues. Socrates described himself as a gadfly. He thought that his unique mission in life was to approach those most confident in their knowledge and ask them probing questions. Not intended to be embarrassing, the questions nonetheless do require us to examine the grounds on which we adopt our beliefs and our positions. Through such relentless questioning, we come to see that what we thought were legitimate grounds are either confused or patently false or contradictory, based on self-deception or an entirely misapprehending vocabulary, a failure at the level of words, a failure at the level of definitions, a failure to appreciate even the importance of definition as we begin to defend one or another thesis. So this is somebody who's going to irritate the way gadflies can irritate. A word about gadflies. Recall that gadflies are very pesky creatures. In ancient Greek mythology, one of them actually knocked a chap off his horse who had been trying to fly all the way up to heaven and engage hubristically in arrogating to himself the powers of the divine. It was a gadfly that Zeus sent to sting winged Pegasus and thus unhorse Bellerophon. There lay Bellerophon, back on earth, even as Pegasus continued the ascent to Olympus. Now, in casting himself as a gadfly, Socrates is claiming more than the rank of a busybody in the agora. He is a gadfly in just that sense of unseating the confident rider who believes he's on a flight path to the truth. Do you see? This horse takes me to heaven because I deserve to be there. Along comes the gadfly. Next thing you know, you're looking up at the stars. In Socrates, we see the often whimsical and deft conversationalist who really can catch you up short if you're not wary. Socrates was well trained in this art because he was well trained by the great sophist teachings of his time. So he knows a sophistical argument when he hears one, and he can put one together himself if the case requires it. Was Socrates then just another sophist, able in the art of rhetoric and the right sort of teacher for litigious Athenians? The sophists, after all, were famous for developing arguments that would equip students to score victories in debate, their adversaries inevitably caught up in logical contradiction, conceptual confusion. We must be careful here. The philosophy of the sophists is rich and variegated, not to be reduced to a sentence or two. So I don't want to libel or trivialize so-called sophistical teaching. That teaching includes, among its ranks, Protagoras himself. But there is, I think, a defensible sense in which one of the central aims of, shall we say, sophistical teaching is a rhetorical aim. It has as its goal an argumentative form likely to be successful, not in quite the trite way that later schools of rhetoric might come to practice, but to some extent the aim of the sophist is to expose the ignorance of his interlocutor. Socrates is going beyond that. It's not just to expose the ignorance of an interlocutor. It's to find the truth, and finally to defeat skepticism itself. So we would not want to say that Socrates, in his sophistical art and practice, is himself a sophist. Erasmus, who I think probably comes as close to being a thoroughly civilized human being as anyone would have the right to claim, used to refer to his Saint Socrates. Augustine, who knew much about ancient Greek philosophy and was quite wary about the teaching and philosophizing of those pagans, well, St. Augustine was fully prepared to reserve almost exclusively to Socrates the title philosopher. And why was that? Because in Socrates he found someone who was prepared to die for what he believed. Augustine here is establishing a very demanding standard, a mortal standard. The first obligation of a philosopher is a commitment to live according to the terms of his own philosophy. Were we able or willing to impose that standard on all the major figures in the history of philosophy, I think we'd find any number of them leaving the field pretty quickly. In fact, I think most of the skeptics, for example, would be out of town before sundown. It is said that one of the great fathers of skeptical thought was Pyrrho of Elea, so-called Pyrrhonism, being an early form of radical skepticism. And it is said that Pyrrho's friends used to accompany him everywhere because in his skepticism, he denied the reality of the heat of fire or that one would actually drown in water and so forth. So it is said that in their solicitude, Pyrrho's chums would keep him out of self-destructive modes of behavior. Nonetheless, the story does come down to us that on one occasion, he is found chasing his cook down the streets of Athens with a frying pan in his hand for having served his friends a bad meal. So even the great Pyrrhonist skeptic Pyrrho himself drew a line under skepticism below which he would not go, his line apparently having much to do with the ancient cuisine. Now, Socrates was prepared to live, and I should say more importantly maybe, for him surely more importantly, to die for what it was that his philosophical inquiries presented as true. I won't dilate on the well-known tale of Socrates' trial and self-execution, just to say these few things. The trial was to some extent trumped up. The charges were that Socrates had failed to respect the gods of Athens and had corrupted Athenian youth. Socrates, the one given to us by Xenophon, turns out in fact to be a deeply religious and reverential man. There's nothing in the record to suggest that he was at all skeptical at the level we'd be inclined to call the religious or spiritual. That he was less than obeisant to the customary devotional beliefs and practices of his contemporary Athenians, there is no doubt. But this is just to say that he regarded some of these customs as nothing but the habit of sloth, immunized against critical thought and its challenges. Now, that he corrupted the youth of Athens, I think, is a rather different charge. The youth of Athens had any number of ways of corrupting themselves. In the one dialogue in which you might find debauchery and the corruption of the young taking place, I refer, of course, to the symposion. It's Alcibiades who's complaining that in attempting to be Socrates' lover, one gets nowhere. The fellow simply will not participate at that rich, lusty, corporeal level. This is a plaintive Alcibiades explaining to everybody what one has to go through with this fellow Socrates. And it's quite interesting the way the symposium ends. I've always found this to be one of the most poignant features in all of Plato's dialogues, the very end of Symposion. This is an all-night drinking party, animated by discussions of the nature of love and kindred subjects. It is Socrates who leaves early in the morning, and as Plato tells us, quote, returns home alone. It's an extraordinarily vivid picture of how the man was perceived. This social gadfly, this skillful conversationalist, given his very wisdom and the depth of his thought, must have been among the most loneliest people who ever lived in any society, including that one. Now, as for the trial itself, the charges were trumped up. Perjured testimony was given. He was found guilty, then given a choice between death or exile. Exile in the ancient Greek world was a customary sentence for offenses of this kind. It was called ostracism, and it usually carried with it a term of not less than 10 years. In fact, charges leading to the same punishment were made against Pericles himself when plague broke out in the city and the war with Sparta was going badly. So it would not have been totally dishonorable to be subjected to exile. I mean, it would have been a mark against one, obviously, but given the trumped-up charges, the nature of the trial, Socrates certainly, with a smile on his face, could have accepted a period of exile. Socrates was told truthfully by his friends that most Athenians knew the charges were trumped up, No one wanted Socrates to die, and that were he to attempt an escape, the guards would simply look the other way. He could leave the city, could just go away for a time, and once things cooled off, return no worse the wear for it. Surely a good man shouldn't kill himself because a bunch of liars got together and made a mischief. You know, there's a kind of ethical proposition here. If in fact you've been done in by perjured testimony, why should you accept the punishment at all? Now Socrates listened to all this patiently. He knows that his friends want him to live. But of course nobody knows more thoroughly than Socrates himself that the charges against him were indeed lies, perjured testimony, coming from envious and predictable sources. But he's not going to hightail it out of Athens, for he is not going to break the law. Why not? Because he recognizes that the rule of law is the corporate or public expression of human rationality itself. Law is the means by which the rational power of corruptible man might minimize the corruption. Decades later, in attempting to define the law, and at the end of his treatise on politics, Aristotle will say, "Diopera nourexios nous onamos estin." The law is reason without passion. Nous, anu orexios, reason without passion. It is disinterested reason. It's the application of reason not in such a way as to benefit this person or that person. Rather, it is to be for the benefit of justice itself. So, unto the last, Socrates is a teacher, now instructing his melancholy friends in what he takes to be this obvious fact. Here he says, I've devoted my entire life to the cause of reason, and now, just because my own particular situation is compromised, you know, I'm facing a rather severe sentence, I'm supposed to abandon all that I stood for, everything I stood for, all that I taught, all that I believed, to the very quick of my nature. I'm supposed to turn and run like a thief in the night. And then what would my life have meant? No. He drinks the poison hemlock. It is in Plato's Phaedo that Socrates speaks his final words. Having reassured all and asked them to give him some peace, he grows cold. And then he says, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Will you remember to pay the debt? His final words have to do with a sacrifice he owed to the god of healing. I've always found rich symbolism here, for Socrates himself was sacrificed for the healing power of philosophy. And ironically, the dialogue ends with Socrates entirely faithful to custom, whereas the charge against him was that he had violated custom. This ending, you see, is Homeric in all of its defining features. Do you think again of Hector, breaker of horses? Do you see? Ah, the unexamined life is not worth living. Here is a stock Socratic teaching. The unexamined life is not worth living. Well, why is that? What's wrong at the end of the day with consuming narcotics that keep one in a state of pleasure and peace? Or supplying them to others as a profession? What's wrong, if it's possible, with allowing surgeons to remove one's brain and put it in a vat, and through the proper application of electrical stimulation, play into that brain everything one could possibly desire, or think, or feel, answer every need, every want, every whim. One might have the experience of being Solon, or the Socrates of the dialogues, or Napoleon, but this time, let's say, victorious at Waterloo. Now, what would be wrong with that? After all, people do aspire to success and achievement. Remember the discussion that Croesus has with Solon. Would one not want to be the happiest of men, where every one of life's desires is realized? Yet it does seem safe to say that no competent person would willingly enter into this sort of existence. I refer here to a brain in the vat. Now, I'm reluctant to call it this sort of life, for what is promised here is not life, but the illusion of life. What's wrong with this is that it's not a lived life. It's simply a screen on which events are played out. Socrates did not live in our technical world of microsurgery and pharmacology. Thus, in Plato's Republic, Socrates does not consider brains in vats, but he does consider prisoners in the depths of a cave, who have objects and events projected on some parapet in front of them. They think it's reality, whereas it's no more than merely shadows and illusion. What Socrates is at pains to make clear is that behind every experience, there is room for an interpretation of the meaning of that experience. And it's in the interpretation, the examination of what our life is amounting to, that in fact life becomes worth living. It's not the sequence of passive experiences. It's the integration of those experiences into some intelligible whole that constitutes a veritable form of life, and one subject to refinement through self-criticism, through reflection. And for it to be a worthy life, the experiences themselves have to have a validity. They have to have truthfulness about them. Otherwise, we're living the life of one in a drunken stupor, one chained in the bowels of a cave, one afloat as a brain in a vat. Now, this takes me again to the temple dedicated to Apollo at Delphi, and that commanding inscription that figures in every introductory philosophy course, and even in fortune cookies in Chinese restaurants. Know the seauton, know thyself. Now, how are we to understand that, know thyself? Was Socrates urging some sort of 1960s West Coast mode of self-discovery? Does the full weight of know the seauton finally yield questions of the sort, am I surfing too much and reading too little? No. It's not knowing oneself that way. It's knowing what it means in the fullest sense, what it means to be a certain kind of being. And in this particular case, what it means to be a human being. This must reach towards something other than our mere biology, because we have a common biology. There are human beings covering the face of the earth, as was known in Socrates' time, and presumably they have a common biology. So to know the biological picture is not to know oneself. It might be to know the constituents that make up potentially self-knowing entities. Nonetheless, take any large sample of such beings, each having the same biological constitution, more or less anyway, and within that sample you will find a riot of beliefs, convictions, superstitions, mystical, cultish orientations, forms of debauchery, forms of virtue, forms of genius, forms of self-degradation. Now, this is all taking place in beings who, and at a biological level, are pretty much the same. They're all human beings. They all began as babies. They all bleed when cut, etc. So biology can't be the way one goes about knowing oneself in this Socratic sense. Biology may be the way you go about understanding a particular species or genus of things, what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a cat, etc. But that certainly can't answer the question, what kind of person am I, essentially? Socrates' life as a teacher was devoted to the question, what kinds of beings are we? Because only after reaching a defensible position on that question might we proceed to how should we live our lives? What is the right form of government? What's the relationship between the individual and the polis? Today we might say between the citizen and the state. To know thyself presupposes the capacity to know anything. I mean, if we're totally skeptical at the level of knowledge, then the question know thyself is as unanswerable as the question know anything. Now, you may know many things and still not know thyself in the Socratic sense. But to know thyself is minimally to know. And so Socrates begins with that core question, that core problem, the problem of knowledge. How do we know anything? And if the skeptics are right in being skeptical about any and every knowledge claim, then they're going to be right in spades about a claim of knowing oneself. If you can't really know anything for certain, then you certainly cannot know thyself in any settled and certain way. And that means that your life is uselessly examined. What could the examined life be? It simply would be a constellation of prejudices and self-deceptions. You might as well get into the vat, or at least allow your brain to be put there. So what has to be defeated here is skepticism. It has to be defeated at least insofar as one can establish a good philosophical basis on which to claim that there is something we actually can know. Descartes is going to do the same sort of thing centuries later. We're going to have to come up with at least one kernel of truth that we can settle on as true, and that will settle the root epistemological question, is it possible to know anything? Now, if we can answer yes, yes, it is possible to know something, and to know that you know it, and to know the method you used to come to know it, then maybe we've got a method for uncovering yet other things. So you begin to see that the Socratic agenda is a fairly broad one. First, one has to do legitimate battle, philosophical battle, gentle battle, with skepticism and cynicism. These schools of thought are in place at the time. Socrates must deal with them. And we will see how he does when we examine several of Plato's dialogues. He must also contend with the problem of conduct. What kind of life is right for beings such as ourselves? Should we aim solely at happiness and pleasure? And what of happiness? Are we all the same in this regard? Does it differ from place to place, time to time, culture to culture? And what of our values? Are they simply reflections of our own prejudices, giving us no right or reason to impose them on others, or expect anyone else to share them? As we say today, is it all relative? And what of the problem of governance and the vaunted democracy of the Athenian state? Of course, this was not the sort of democracy that today's citizens of the so-called Western democracies routinely describe as a democratic form of government. But by ancient standards, it is the first of its kind and extraordinary. It was fully participatory, except for slaves and women. The Athenian treasured the democratic character of the polis, and a philosopher could well expect trouble when challenging its core precepts. Socrates raised grave questions about such precepts. Suppose, for argument's sake, that the polis contained 11,000 people, of whom 10,994 are certifiable fools and 6 are wise men. Now, do you want to take binding votes on important matters where democracy requires rule by 10,994 to 6 majorities? As we shall see, Aristotle will defend democratic precepts on the grounds that, all other things being equal, you're likely to get more sheer cleverness, intelligence, and perspicuity out of 100 people than out of 1. That is, their strengths are likely to be additive, whereas their weaknesses might be self-canceling. Nonetheless, Socrates reserves to himself the right at least to raise the question, how should we be governed? And you cannot answer a question like that in the abstract. You can't answer the question of how we should be governed unless you've already established what kind of life is the right kind of life for us to live. And you can't answer that question until you've settled the question, what kind of beings are we, and how is it that we can come to know so much? So until you've successfully defeated a skeptical position on knowledge, you can't have a defensible, let alone compelling position on ethics. And until you've handled the ethical dimension of life, you can't have much of a handle on what political organization the polis should be. It is a credit to Socrates' lasting genius that he understands the interconnectedness of these questions, that the problem of knowledge, the problem of conduct, and the problem of governance are various phases of the same kind of problem. And that problem is how we come to know ourselves and realize our humanity in the course of a lifetime.